I don't really know what to do with China Jones. I will say the narrative for this I just thought was not very good, and that's when you don't consider the racist aspect of this. So even if it wasn't racist, I just feel like the narrative wasn't very well developed. But obviously, you can't watch this and not look at the various awkward depictions. This is a 1959 Warner Brothers cartoon directed by Robert McKimson and written by Ted Pierce, and we have Mel Blanc and June Foray voicing various characters. And interestingly, Mel Blanc voices Daffy Duck but with an Irish accent. And I read the description for this before I watched it, and I was actually really curious to hear what that would sound like. And I mean, it's not the best Irish accent I've ever heard, but it's just bizarre how you can recognize it as Daffy, but it's an Irish accent, um, which I thought was actually quite fascinating. And if that's as far as the stereotypical depictions went, maybe it would be okay. But after Daffy, who is playing a private eye, finds a message in a fortune cookie saying that somebody is trapped in a factory, they need help. Um, it becomes very racist after that point, and we have a lot of kind of Asian stereotypes and various different caricatures of different kinds of I say typical, stereotypical um, Asian characters, the kind that you will often see in cartoons from this time. Some of them I feel like are not that bad, and some of them I feel like really are. So while Daffy's off trying to solve this fortune cookie problem, we the viewer learn more than Daffy does, which in itself is always an interesting trope, and I think that's something that can work very well when it's done right. But I feel like the development of the narrative was just all over the place, and it kept throwing things up at random intervals in a way that kind of felt forced. So the narrative itself, although an interesting concept of, somebody potentially sending a message in a fortune cookie, fair enough, interesting. Daffy is a private eye we've seen before, it does work as a character. But the narrative just didn't work for me. And then you have, I mean, Porky Pig. I won't explain too much about what Porky Pig is like, but it's so uncomfortable. It really is. So I have to say I didn't like it. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to look at decisions that were made and decisions that they believed were okay. And as I said, had it just been Daffy doing an Irish accent, yeah, fair enough. Wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. But then you bring in a lot of other racial stereotypes and really terrible accents. I mean, Daffy's Irish accent's pretty terrible as well, but it's not as bad as some of the others. Yeah, it's worth watching from a historical animation perspective, um, which I always think is the case. I'm very much a strong believer that the Warner Brothers censored 11s, which this isn't one, so it's definitely not as bad as a lot of their cartoons. But I always believe they should never be banned because I think you have to learn from them. If you ignore history, you can't learn from it. So I think if you're interested in the history of animation, and particularly the way certain stereotypes were portrayed, I think this is a pretty good example, as are the censored 11s, of course, which I recommend checking out. As long as you're in the right frame of mind and don't get too annoyed by them. China Jones is not the worst cartoon I've ever seen, but by no means did I enjoy it. It's definitely problematic in some places. I recommend it for an interest. If you're interested in this kind of thing and want to see certain depictions and how times have changed, then I would recommend it. But just purely from an entertainment perspective, definitely not at all.